Hello, everybody, and welcome to Fuel Freedom's book club discussion with Dr. Robert Zubrin, author of the book Energy Victory. Zubrin is an expert on energy issues. He holds a doctorate in nuclear engineering and is a world-renowned engineer. Now I will turn the floor over to Dr. Zubrin so he can discuss his book Energy Victory. Thank you, Dr. Zubrin.
Well, thank you. And thanks to everybody who's listening in and for your involvement in Fuel Freedom, because I think this is perhaps the most critical issue facing the nation and humanity right now. Right now, the price of oil is over $100 a barrel. 10 years ago at this time, it was about $22 a barrel. So the price of oil has gone up fivefold in a decade. Okay. Whose fault is this? Various political partisans, might blame it on Obama or on the oil companies, depending upon which side of the fence they're on. But the fact of the matter is the reason why the price of oil has shot up fivefold in the past decade is because of OPEC. And here is the proof. If you look at these two charts that I am displaying right here in front of you right now, these compare crude oil production from both non-OPEC countries and from OPEC countries from 1973 to today, or on these charts, not quite to today, but to the near present, and also the price. Now, there is not a difference between the OPEC price and the non-OPEC price. There's more or less one world oil price, and that's what it is. So the black lines on the two charts are the same. But the red lines, which represent production, are radically different. If you look at the chart on your left, the non-OPEC countries' averages, what you'll see is that it has, over the past 40 years, almost doubled. And that's what you'd actually expect, because over the past 40 years, the world economy has doubled in size. The world population has increased by about 60%. And so you would expect production to go up. And so you can see with minor fluctuations, we see a constantly rising curve of non-OPEC oil production. But if you look at the chart on your right, we look at the OPEC oil production, you see that it has no resemblance to that. It's up, it's down, it's all over the place. That shows tactical manipulation of the market. But what's even more remarkable about this chart is that between 1973 and today, after all the shouting is over, OPEC oil production has not increased at all. That is, after 4 decades, during which time the world economy has doubled, OPEC has not increased its production by a barrel. Now, if you actually took this chart backwards to 1960, when OPEC was founded, okay, it went up substantially. Between 1960 and 73, OPEC production went up 8 million barrels to 30 million barrels, okay, in 1973. And if you went back to the end of World War II, it went up from a couple of million barrels in 1945 of the countries that subsequently became OPEC to 8 in 1960 and 30 in 1973, but it's still 30 today, okay? And that is incredible. Despite the fact that they own 80% of the world's oil reserves, including all the easiest to drill stuff, they haven't increased their production at all. And that's just wild. Okay, so what OPEC is like, it's like a cruel dog owner who puts the collar nice and snug around the neck of a puppy and leaves it set exactly that way while the dog grows. So the collar gets tighter and tighter until the dog chokes, possibly to death. Now, somebody comes along and says, well, it was just the growth of the dog that killed the dog. No, it was the collar that choked the dog. Dogs grow. That's what they should do, okay? It's the collar that choked the dog. Similarly, OPEC has put a collar around a substantial part of world oil production and used it to choke the world of liquid fuels, driving the price of oil up. So some pro-OPEC columnists, people in the Wall Street Journal, say, well, you know, there's no problem here. The reason why the price of oil is going up is because the Chinese economy is growing. It's grown a lot over the past 10 years. And it's true, the Chinese economy has grown very substantially over the past 10 years. But we actually had much higher global rates of economic growth in the post-war period from 1945 to 1973. And the price of oil was completely stable. That is, between 47 and 72, the price of oil adjusted for inflation was absolutely flat. Okay? And that drove the greatest economic boom in world history. Okay, the transformation of America from Depression America to suburbia America, with people living in houses in the suburbs and having 2 cars per family and color TVs, and the middle class, most of them going to college. Okay, that all happens in that period. And Europe is rebuilt, and Japan is rebuilt, and Taiwan industrializes, and South Korea substantially industrializes. That all happens, and you have global economic growth rates of order of 5%, something much more than we've seen in the past 10 years. But the price of oil was flat. And that is because during that period, the oil production of the OPEC countries was controlled by the oil multinationals, by Exxon, British Petroleum, Chevron, Shell, and what have you. And their policy was to grow production to match the growth of the world economy, so as to grow the world economy and grow their market. In 1973, control of the concessions passed, in conjunction with the embargo, control of the concessions passed to the OPEC governments and their state-owned oil production companies, and a new policy was put in place. Instead of growing production to grow the economy, it was to constrict production to loot the world economy. And this is actually an extraordinary crime against humanity, because it's not just a matter of, you know, for Americans it may be a matter of convenience. We're annoyed when gas costs $4 a gallon. We can remember when it cost $3, $2, $1. And you know, it's annoying when you have to pay $50 when you fill up your tank, but you can afford it. But it's one thing to pay that kind of price for gas when you live in a country where the average person makes $45,000 a year. It's another thing if you live in, say, Kenya, where the average person makes $2,000 a year. Okay, so this is an extraordinary, regressive tax on the world economy. And if you want to see the effect of it, though, on the U.S. economy, which is actually the best suited to absorb the hit, okay, nevertheless, the effect on our economy is profound. Here I have a graph which graphs oil prices adjusted for inflation. So these are inflation-adjusted 2010 dollars. That's the unmarked blue line, against the U.S. unemployment rate, marked with the little purple squares. And what you can see is every time the price of oil goes up, U.S. unemployment shoots up a few months later, okay? And this is repeated. This happened in 73, 74 with the first oil shock. It happened in 79, 80 with the second oil shock. It happened in a lesser way in 91 and 2001 in conjunction with the smaller shocks associated with the Desert Storm and 9/11. And then it happened in a huge way in 2008 when oil spiked to all the way up to actually $140 a barrel at its peak. And within 6 months, 9 million Americans were thrown out of work. And this is what crashed the world economy. Yes, it is true that the proximate cause of the bank failures was the failure of the mortgage-backed securities. But there is a well-known and direct correlation between the rate of mortgage default and the unemployment rate, for the simple reason that unemployed people can't pay their mortgages. So when someone's laid off, they default on their mortgages, the mortgage-backed securities become worthless, and the banks holding them go under, and you get into the world of $800 billion bank bailouts and similar phenomena that we have enjoyed for the past 5 years. Okay, so this is what did it. Okay, now, when people think of our dependence on foreign oil, what occurs immediately to many people of my age or older — I was 21 in 1973, just entering the job market, and I can remember how bad it was. You couldn't get a job. We had a massive increase in unemployment with the oil shock, and of course there was chaos at the pumps where they were out of gas and people getting siphoned so they could steal gas from other people's cars overnight and so forth. Well, could that happen again? Yeah. Would it be as bad? No. It would be much worse, because in 1973, the United States was 30% dependent on foreign oil. Today, we're 60%. So the effects of an embargo would be much worse. Okay, but furthermore, and this is even more serious, in 1973, OPEC did not have much in the way of cash reserves. The price of oil had been $3 a barrel up to the day before the embargo. They didn't have much cash reserves, so they could not sustain the embargo very long. They had to soften it up relatively quickly. That's no longer the case. Now they have trillions of dollars worth of cash reserves. So they could sustain an embargo for a much greater length of time and do incredible damage to the economy of the industrial world. And this is a disaster waiting to happen. However, they actually have a more potent weapon, which is takeover. That is, the cash itself is the weapon. An embargo is a risky play. In '73, in fact, there was talk in the Nixon administration of U.S. military action to break the embargo. It didn't happen, but it could have. If they were to do something like this now, it's conceivable again. Why risk it? Okay, when they're winning as things stand. For instance, last year, OPEC cleared $1 trillion in net export profits. Now, you take the entire worth of the U.S. Fortune 500. It's $18 trillion. Okay, so at this rate of profit, OPEC will accumulate enough funds to buy majority control of every company in the entire Fortune 500 within 9 years. And in general, of course, you don't need majority control of a company in order to have effective control. You just need a controlling interest. So we're talking about the ability to take over a very substantial fraction of the corporate world in the U.S. and Europe as well. And they are following this up. The Saudis have launched a $900 billion sovereign wealth fund to do exactly such takeovers. And most of the other OPEC countries have also launched sovereign wealth funds in the $100 billion class or better. So this is a direct threat. This is a direct threat to our sovereignty. If you take over the corporations, you take over their lobbyists, you can affect U.S. foreign policy, you can affect U.S. energy policy. There's very little you can't do. You take over media corporations, and there have been purchases into U.S. media. For example, Prince bin Talal of Saudi Arabia bought a 6% share of News Corp, which owns Fox and the Wall Street Journal and the London Times. Okay? And he also bought a substantial stake in AOL Time Warner, which owns Time Magazine and CNN. So they can actually affect our debate. They can get us debating some things and not talking at all about other things, such as an effective policy to break their power. Okay. So this is a real threat. Now, how do we break this threat? Their power comes from a monopoly, a vertical monopoly on transportation fuel. Now, it's got to be understood that that is where our energy problem is. It's not in electrical power generation. Okay, we don't import any electrical power. We generate all our electric power with coal, nuclear power, natural gas, some with renewables, certainly hydroelectric. Okay, there's no problem there at all. You can generate electricity with any number of means. But right now, speaking in the large, there's only one way to make anything move on the surface of the earth, and that is with petroleum-derived fuels. Okay, you know, cars, trucks, airplanes, even things that used to move by coal, like ships and trains, now all move by oil. Okay, and so that makes it, as it were, the Trump suit of the various energy sources. Okay, the others just don't matter as much. We have flexibility there right now, but we don't have flexibility in transportation fuel. Now, there is a way to make that happen. Okay, there's a technology known as flex fuel cars. It's now been in existence for 30 years. The first flex fuel cars were invented at Ford by a team led by Roberta Nichols, these kind of cars can burn any combination of alcohols or gasoline. Now, the alcohol involved can be either methanol or ethanol, or in principle a higher alcohol like propanol or butanol as well. Right now, because of computer control of cars which sniff the exhaust and determine whether it's running fuel-rich or fuel-lean, essentially all cars have the capability to be flex fuel cars. The only difference is in the programming of the electronic control unit, the ECU, and also in some cases the materials used in the fuel line. There's no significant difference in cost to create a car as a flex fuel car than a gasoline-only car. And actually, when I wrote this chart, it was $100 difference. Now there's no difference. And in fact, a lot of cars, in particular, well, essentially all cars sold in the United States since around 2006 have had flex fuel capability, but only a tiny minority of them have been sold as flex fuel cars. And we can get into this. But in some cases, the cars actually have the flex fuel program in the computer and it's active and they just don't tell the buyer. And in other cases, the program is in the computer, but it has been disabled by the manufacturer. Virtually all cars sold in the U.S. today are also sold in Brazil, and every one of them sold there is sold as a flex fuel car. We'll talk a little bit more about Brazil later. So there is nothing to stop us from simply requiring that all automobiles sold in the U.S. have their flex fuel capability activated. Okay, but because right now there just aren't enough of them to turn the trick. Okay, see, here's the problem. Despite essentially zero added cost, the flex fuel cars today only comprise about 3% of auto sales. Okay, now, and there's very little incentive for consumers to demand flex fuel cars from the automakers because the alternative fuel pumps are quite rare. Practically the only ones there are E85, and they are few and far between. Methanol fuel pumps are about as rare as unicorns. Okay, so now why are there so few E85 pumps? Well, because if you're at a gas station and you have 3 pumps, you're not going to devote one of them to a kind of fuel that only 3% of the cars can use. So what's the solution? The solution is government action. Okay, a flex fuel mandate requiring that all new cars sold in the U.S. be flex fuel. Now, if we had such a law, within 3 years, we'd have 40 million cars on the road in the United States that could use alcohol fuels, and hundreds of millions worldwide. And the reason for that is if we made it the law that to sell a car in the USA, it's got to be flex fuel, you'd have the foreign car makers switching their lines over entirely. Japanese cars sold not just in the U.S. but in Japan and all over Asia would be flex fueled. European cars sold in Europe and here and in South America would be flex fuel. And then you would start to see E85 and M85 pumps appearing rapidly all over the world. And gasoline would be forced to compete against both ethanol and methanol all over the world. And this would create a permanent competitive constraint on the price of oil. And so you could not have the arbitrary rigging up of oil prices by OPEC that we saw in the first several charts. They would be constrained. And in fact, we would probably force the price of oil down to the range of around $50 a barrel, and it would keep it there, fenced in by competition. Now, what are the global consequences of this? Okay, it would create a huge advanced sector market for both natural gas and third world agricultural produce. Let me explain. While ethanol at this point, from a practical point of view, has to be made from sugars or starches, methanol, okay, the simplest alcohol, can be readily made from natural gas, from coal, from biomass, and even from recycled urban trash. Anything that either is or was ever a plant can be turned into methanol. And we're not talking here about some futuristic technology that will require magical biotech to create super bacteria that make methanol. No, methanol is made today. It is one of the top 5 chemical commodities produced in the world. Its current, well, its average spot price over the past couple of years has oscillated around $1.20 a gallon without any subsidy. Okay, now methanol has about half the energy per gallon of gasoline, but it's higher octane, so it's effectively worth about 60% as much as gasoline in terms of how many miles it gets a car. So $1.20 methanol is like $2 gasoline as a bargain. And so that's very competitive against $3, $3.50, $4 gasoline. Okay, that is basically competitive at gasoline coming from $60 oil. Now, and you can make it from natural gas. So we've got this huge natural gas glut in this country right now. It has crashed the price of natural gas to 1/3 of what it was a few years ago. Natural gas is so cheap right now that they're flaring vast amounts of it. Right now, the flaring is so great in the Bakken, for example, in North Dakota, that North Dakota, seen from space, is almost as bright as New York City. Now, furthermore, third world agricultural produce. Actually, ethanol can be produced economically from sugar in third world countries. In some places, for instance, in Africa, the price of ethanol is as low as 80 cents a gallon. So that's pretty competitive. Also, biomass. That is not food-based biomass, but just agricultural or forestry residues, for example, can be used to produce methanol. Now, this would allow us to relieve a major problem that has blocked third world development for some time, which is advanced sector trade barriers against third world agricultural produce. Okay, if we had this kind of market for agriculturally derived fuels, third world countries would have a market in the advanced sector for these fuels. That means tropical agricultural countries could secure income for development. So instead of us selling our corporations to Saudi Arabia, we could be selling tractors to South America and Africa because they have the money to buy manufactured equipment from us and other industrial nations. The vertical monopoly held by the oil cartel of the world's transportation fuel supply would be broken. Oil prices would be constrained, which would really boost the world economy. The terrorist funding will be curtailed. The threat of superpower confrontation over the Middle East would be halted or certainly mitigated. Global warming would be countered, and conventional pollution would be sharply reduced because the alcohol fuels are actually much cleaner burning than petroleum-derived fuels. They don't have aromatics in them, for example, which are carcinogens. And they are much lower in their carbon monoxide releases and substantially lower in NOx releases as well. And they have no particulate emissions. Okay. Now, isn't it interesting that when I first was circulating the manuscript for Energy Victory to find a publisher, one New York-based publisher, where the editor was a quite liberal person, was very taken aback by my thesis. He said, you know, look what you're going to do. You're going to take away this money from all these poor Arabs. Well, let's put on our compassionate social welfare hearts and look at this problem objectively. In 2012, Saudi Arabia, with 24 million people, received $300 billion from oil exports. Same year, Kenya, 36 million people, a bit more, but same league, earned $4 billion in foreign exchange from all export sources, a substantial amount of which had to go to pay for overpriced fuel imports. Distributed elsewhere, Saudi oil profits could double the foreign exchange of 100 countries like Kenya. Actually, that's not accurate. It's 75, but even so. Distributed elsewhere, the $1 trillion a year that went to OPEC could supply 16 times the cash as the $60 billion in foreign aid now going to the third world from all advanced sector countries combined. That is, if you take the U.S. foreign aid, put together with the European nation's foreign aid, which in many cases is very substantial, and with that of the Catholic Church, and with private organizations, the Red Cross, Christian Aid, Oxfam, take them all, the works. It's $60 billion a year in aid going to the third world. Okay, this is 16 times that. So what you're talking about is creating an immense financial engine for third world development, something that could really deal with the issue of global poverty, not in a token way, not in a feel-good way, but really do the job. So hundreds of billions of dollars that's now going to fund evil could go to do a great deal of good. All right, now, one thing that was publicized that I'm sure you've all heard of, and this concerns ethanol, not methanol, but even so, is a story that we have a food versus fuel problem, that by producing more ethanol, we are taking food out of people's mouths. Now, this was actually propagated in 2008 by a global PR campaign run through the Glover Park public relations firm, which is listed by the U.S. Justice Department as an agent of the United Arab Emirates. Okay, but this was an enormous distraction campaign that was launched when oil went above $100 a barrel in 2008. And they went after ethanol because they wanted to knock out the farm lobby as a potential political force that would push for flex fuel capability in the United States and elsewhere. But it, in fact, is not true. And here is the data that shows that it's not true. Okay, this compares the total corn supply available in 2002 to 2007, okay, which was the most recent year after this campaign, prior to the launching of this campaign. Well, what do we have? Look at this. In 2002, the United States produced 10.5 billion bushels of corn. It used 1 billion bushels to make ethanol, producing 3 billion gallons, okay, leaving about 9.5 billion bushels of corn to have as food. In 2007, we produced 14.4 billion bushels of corn. We used 3 to make ethanol. That is, the amount of ethanol we produced tripled, okay, leaving 11.4 billion bushels left as corn, but also producing 800 million bushels of distiller's grain, a high-protein byproduct that is left over when you make ethanol if you do it efficiently, leaving a total of 12.2 billion bushels of corn or distiller's grain combined. So the amount of ethanol tripled, but the amount of corn available did not go down. In fact, it increased 30%. Now, why is this? It's because farmers produce in response to demand. The food versus fuel argument is false for the same reason as the overpopulation argument has always turned out to be false. Some of you may remember back in 1968, a man named Paul Ehrlich wrote a book called The Population Bomb, in which he said the world population is going to double by the turn of the century. And so there's hungry people now. They'll be starving everywhere unless we stop the population explosion. Well, the world population actually has doubled since 1968. But in fact, people around the world are eating better today than they were then. And that is because farmers produce in response to demand. And not only that, the bigger the agricultural market, the more money goes into agricultural R&D, and so the faster the increase in crop yields occurs. So the food versus fuel argument is simply not factual. And while some people can, it's a rational argument, although I actually disagree with it, but I'll admit that a reasonable person could advance it, that the ethanol program shouldn't be supported because it's had subsidies, although it no longer has subsidies. And there's a mandate to use a certain amount of ethanol, which is a distortion of the free market. The argument against ethanol that it is reducing the world's food supply is simply not factual. Okay. Now, earlier I said that we have practically all the cars being sold in the U.S. right now, and for the past half decade have been flex fuel cars that are not being marketed that way. Why not? Okay, this is a very serious question, okay, because they could be done. Now, one answer is that, well, the management of the auto companies are holding out because they can use the introduction of flex fuel cars as a concession to the EPA against CAFE standards, and they say, well, if we make this many more cars flex fuel, will you give us a break on the CAFE standard? And it's a bargaining point, and why give away what you can trade for? Well, maybe, but you have to understand that the auto companies went for two of the three major U.S. auto companies, GM and Chrysler, went bankrupt in 2008, and all their stockholders were wiped out because the price of oil was allowed to soar. The price of oil was able to soar because the oil had no competition at the pump. If they had made their cars methanol flex fuel cars, they could have prevented that oil price spike and saved themselves. So they were not only betraying U.S. national interest by not making their cars flex fuel, they were actually betraying the interests of their own stockholders. So how could that be? How could any management decide to do that? Well, it's an interesting question, and one answer is there appears to be a massive conflict of interest in the management of these companies, in the ownership of these companies. And this is very easy to see in Europe because of certain transparency laws that they have that unfortunately we don't, and I'll get to that in a minute. But for instance, here's a question for you. Who owns Volkswagen, which is the largest auto producer in the world? Well, the answer is effectively Qatar, or Qatar, however you pronounce it. They actually own directly through their sovereign wealth fund 17% share of Volkswagen, and they also have another 10% share owned through Porsche, which they also control. So there it is. You have very substantial investments from sovereign wealth funds of Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates in Daimler, Spyker, and so forth. Now, what about the American companies? Well, that's actually harder to track because around 1974-75, after the first oil embargo, a number of influentials, including Kissinger and William Simon, the Treasury Secretary, they had an idea that they wanted to encourage the recycling of petrodollars into the U.S. economy. That is, all of a sudden these Arabs had all these vast amounts of money they didn't know what to do with, and they wanted them to encourage them to buy U.S. stocks with it. And but they had a problem in that, you know, there's all these redneck congressmen from Oklahoma and Arkansas and places that get all upset about Arabs taking over American companies. So what they did was they passed a regulation that would allow these investors from these companies to take shares up to 4.99%, that is anything up to 5% in American companies, and not have it disclosed on the standard Wall Street disclosures. So, for example, we know, because it's been in the Gulf press, that Prince bin Khalil of Saudi Arabia, okay, bought a 1% share of GM, which actually makes him the fourth largest stockholder in GM. But if you go to the Fidelity website, if you look at GM as an investment and you want to see who the other owners are, it won't show him there. Okay. Back in November of, I forget what was 2010 or 2011, when they did the GM IPO, GM management went around the Persian Gulf, and there are stories you can see in the Gulf press of so-and-so from GM is in town and he's asking for investment money to help support the IPO. Now, this is a very interesting thing, because when you go and ask people for money, it's frequently the case that they tell you that they might be interested in giving you some money, but they would like you to do something for them in return. And so you get GM in 2007 was promising to have half its automobile fleet flex fuel by 2012, and that has not happened. Okay, it's not happened. It's still just a few percent, not 50%, 3-4%. Okay, but in addition to the direct investment from the Arab oil funds, there's another problem, which is that the big investments that we do know about, that you will find on your Fidelity site or whatever you use for your stock investments, you know, and you see your big investments there from J.P. Morgan Chase and Capital World Investors and so forth. Okay, if you look, those funds have much larger investments in oil companies here and abroad. So in other words, you might find a company that is invested several billion in GM but owns 40 billion in investments in oil companies. So to those companies, the primary interest is the oil. Okay? It's not the automobiles. And so inasmuch as they have influence on the management of those auto companies, they will influence them not to do things that would undermine the value of their holdings in petroleum. And so you could call it a conspiracy, you could just call it a conflict of interest. It's certainly a conflict of interest. And in any case, the net result has been that they have not made their fleets flex-fueled, even though they could. And that is why government action is required here. Now, there is another problem that I should mention, okay, which is this. It is possible for private entities to convert cars to be flex-fuel. For instance, I bought a 2007 Chevy Cobalt, which is not a flex-fuel car, but has the same engine and the same computer in it as the HHR, which is a flex-fuel car. And we looked inside its computer and saw that it was indeed a flex-fuel computer with a flex-fuel program that had been disabled by GM. We enabled the flex-fuel program. We ran the car on E85 without any problems. We then ran it on M100 methanol, initially with no problems. Subsequently, there was a problem with the fuel pump, which when we took it out, we saw it had deteriorated in the presence of methanol because the seals in it were made of Viton, which is not methanol compatible. We replaced the seals with one made of Unit N, cost 41 cents, and it since then has run like a top. So what is to stop private individuals with substantial capital would take a significant amount, but in principle it's there, from dealing with this from the bottom up. Well, that is setting up companies that convert people's cars to flex fuel and then setting up methanol pumps to sell to them. That'd be slower than the open fuel standard, but it could potentially make some progress, except for the fact that the EPA has banned such conversions. Okay, and so the EPA is acting to protect the oil cartel as well in this respect. And so we either have to have the open fuel standard passed, which in my view is the best answer, or at least have the regulations changed so that private companies with due certifications can make these conversions and that methanol can be legally sold to such cars. Now, there's another problem here that needs to be talked about. Because, you know, in most things in life, when you pay for something, all you really care about is how much it's costing you and how good the product is that you're getting. But with oil, when you talk about, you know, trillions of dollars going around, you have to ask yourself another question, which is who's getting the money? Because this kind of money isn't just money. This is power. This is power to make things happen in world events. And so who's getting the money? Well, the largest single recipient of oil, international oil revenues by far is Saudi Arabia. It's as large as the next 4 OPEC members combined. Well, what are they doing with the money? Well, some of it they're just wasting. Some of it they're using to buy stakes in American and European corporations. But they're also using very substantial amounts of money to finance and foment terrorism. They have set up over 20,000 madrasas around the world, including, for instance, 1,000 in Pakistan alone, to promote Wahhabism, which is their version of Islam. It is arguably the worst version of Islam. It is violently intolerant, that requires death or enslavement to Christians, Jews, Hindus, Taoists, Buddhists, pagans, atheists, you name it, and Shiites as well. While we hear a lot about this in, for instance, Afghanistan, because we have troops there, and the Taliban was created as a Saudi project. They set up over 1,000 madrasas in Pakistan and funded it, and they provided the money to give the village boys food if they would come to the madrasas and attend, so they would come and they would indoctrinate them and then arm them and set them forth into Afghanistan to terrorize the population. And also now they are a threat to take over Pakistan perhaps as well, and then they would have nuclear weapons. Okay, but it goes way beyond this. This is happening. This is happening in Africa. This is, in Nigeria, terrorizing Christians, in Biafra, in Algeria, terrorizing secular Muslims, in Egypt against Copts, of course, action against Jews in Israel, in Iraq and Afghanistan against American forces, in former Soviet Central Asia against Orthodox Christians, against Buddhists in Thailand and Indonesia, against Catholics in the Philippines, against animists and Christians in Darfur. This is a global jihad that has caused millions of casualties. Then there's number 2, not quite number 2 in oil, but number 2 in terror, which is Iran, which is using its money to promote Hezbollah. Another, if Saudi Arabia has got the hurts of terrorism, Hezbollah is avis. They are number 2. They try harder. And they are now spreading into Latin America. In fact, you may have seen a story in the Wall Street Journal today of our own border police now picking up people coming across the border with Persian tattoos on them. And this is going to be a real problem. So, well, what can I say? That is another reason why this needs to be dealt with. And, of course, Iran is also using the money to fund its atom bomb program. Okay? If they didn't have this kind of money, they couldn't afford an atom bomb program. Okay? And if we didn't need their oil, they wouldn't have an atom bomb program presto allegro, because there's a way to take their oil off the world market straight away. And this brings us to the next subject. The oil industry involves a great deal of money, but it's ultimately not about money. It's about power. And I'm talking here not about electrical power. I'm talking about geopolitical might. And if you look at the history of the 20th century, what you will see is that all the great struggles, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, were all ultimately determined by control over fuel supplies. This is emphatically the case, for instance, in World War II. The Allies won World War II because we controlled the world's fuel. During World War II, the United States alone produced 60% of all the oil produced in the world. That is half again as much fuel as the entire rest of the world put together. The number 2 oil producer was the Soviet Union, which was our ally, with another 15%. Then you have another 10% in Latin America, effectively under American control. Another 10% in the Middle East, effectively under British control. The Axis only had available to it about 5% of the world's oil, primarily the Indonesian oil fields, which the Japanese managed to seize following their initial victories of Pearl Harbor and beyond. And then the Nazis had the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești and the very substantial synthetic oil production facilities of their own at Leona in central Germany. And when we knocked these out, when we actually knocked out the German oil production and stopped the Japanese from having access to the Indonesian oil production by sinking their tankers, their war efforts literally fell apart. On May 12, 1944, the United States Army Air Corps hit Leona in central Germany with 935 B-24s and totally destroyed it in one day. And Albert Speer, who was the Nazi Minister of Armaments, went there actually later that day and saw the wreckage. He said, "That's it, the war's over." And he was basically right. Within 3 months, the Reich was more or less out of gas. The last Panzer offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, literally ran out of gas right on the battlefield, leaving their tanks stranded to be destroyed by American P-47s as soon as the clouds cleared. The Japanese, if you can believe it, in 1945, Imperial Japan, totally on the ropes, was still able to produce 10,000 fighter aircraft. But they couldn't get a single one of them into the sky to challenge the Enola Gay when she showed up over Hiroshima. They were completely out of fuel. They were cut off from their fuel supply in Indonesia, and they fell apart. But if it had been the other way around, if the world's oil supplies had been located in the Axis countries instead of in the Allied countries, they would have won the war. If they could have cut off oil to Britain, there would have been no fighters in the sky over England to save Britain in the Battle of Britain, let alone ships, Navy to protect convoys bringing food and armaments to Britain across the Atlantic, or to protect Allied, or even to have any Allied convoys to Russia, or to power Russian tank armies to fight the Wehrmacht. Okay, they would have been left hopeless, immobilized. They would have all been defeated. And the U.S. would have been unable to project power across the Pacific to challenge the Japanese while they proceeded to conquer Asia at their leisure. So control of the world's fuel is control of the world's future. And we cannot let this power remain in the hands of the enemies of freedom. Now, when you talk about energy independence, a lot of people fade out on you because, they've heard it all. They've heard it all since 1973, since Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, 2 Bushes, Clinton, and Obama. And it hasn't happened. And in fact, it's gotten worse. But it's not because it's intrinsically impossible. Look at this graph. This shows oil dependence of the United States and Brazil from 1980 through, well, in this case, 2006, when Brazil became independent of foreign oil. In 1980, Brazil was 80% dependent on foreign oil, the U.S. 35%. Okay? They are now actually an oil exporter and an ethanol exporter. The U.S. went from 35% in 1980 to over 60% today. Okay. Now, it's true that oil exploitation in Brazil did help, but if it had just been that, they would still be 40% dependent on foreign oil. It is their ethanol program and their flex fuel program that has allowed them to become fully independent, with great benefits both to their economy and also, it must be said, to their environment, because the ethanol burns cleaner than gas. So this is the difference between having a policy and not having a policy, being actually deciding to do something and just letting things drift. Okay, so here's some questions for the reluctant. And here I'm addressing myself particularly to conservatives, many of whom object to the idea of a flex fuel mandate because it's a mandate. Here's the question. In whose interest is it that American cars not be flex fueled? Clearly not in the interest of the American motorist. Clearly not in the interest of the American economy as a whole. Clearly not in the interest of American national security. Okay. In whose interest is it that we don't have fuel choice? Obviously, it's only the interest of the oil cartel. So whose interest should be allowed to prevail? Okay. So what can you do? Well, there's a lot of things you can do, especially if you've been in contact with the Fuel Freedom Foundation. But this is what I tell everybody to do, is to support the Open Fuel Standards Act. Okay, this is a bill that's been introduced into Congress in a bipartisan way. For instance, the lead sponsors this year are Tom Cole, who's a rip-roaring right-wing Republican from Oklahoma, and Eliot Engel, who's a liberal as you please Democrat from New York. This is something we can all get behind. And everyone should call their congressman and ask that they become co-sponsors of this bill. This should not be a partisan issue. Okay? So that's what you should do. And well, here's the congressional switchboard number, but it's probably more effective if you call in your own district. Or even just call and say, I'd like to come down and meet with you in your office and talk about this. And go down there and talk with the congressman about the Open Fuel Standard Act. Sit down with them for half an hour. That counts a lot more than letters and faxes and emails and such. Okay. So to conclude, I think we've got a choice of futures in front of us here. And the question is whether it's going to be largely fueled by petroleum or by alcohols. And so there's a fundamental difference between petroleum and alcohol. Petroleum is a natural resource. Wealth comes through possession of it. Alcohol is a manufactured product. Okay, wealth goes to those who make it, to manufacture product. Natural resources, potentially the price can go up and up over time if they should become scarce. Manufactured products in general, the price goes down over time as technology advances. Okay? A world where natural resources predominate as a source of wealth is a world where power comes from possession. For alcohol, where manufactured products dominate, power comes from human creativity. And you know, there's a notion in economics called the curse of natural resources, where countries who themselves are too dependent upon natural resources for their income, they are prone to tyranny because basically their power elites don't need to develop the human potential of their population. All they need is security guards around their oil wells or gold mines or diamond mines or what have you. Okay, whereas a manufacturing country has to develop and unleash its human creativity. It has to educate its population. It has to make it politically free so it can innovate. It has to assure private property and so forth. Natural resources are something that you fight over. Manufacturing capabilities, you don't. There's never been a war over shoe supplies, okay? Whereas there have been wars over oil supplies and other such things. You know, once again, the petroleum world will be a world of increasing scarcity. The alcohol world will be a world where fuel becomes increasingly cheap and abundant. And one leads to economic stagnation, the other leads to progress. One leads to tyranny, the other to freedom. Okay, whenever the price of oil goes up, it's a blow to freedom. Okay, particularly, for example, in Russia today, where the Putin dictatorship depends upon petroleum revenues as its power base. The Middle East, the countries with the most oil, have the least freedom. Okay, but if we can make the world be free of the power of those people, if we can have the world have unlimited fuel within the power of free nations to manufacture it, the future is unlimited. So with that, I'll conclude and take questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zubrin, for that. We have a few questions for you that came in, and we only have just a few minutes for them, so we'll try to do them as best we can in the time allotted. The first one comes from Stephen, where he asks, I read that the U.S. has overtaken Russia to become a top oil producer based on our fracking technology implementation. Shouldn't that modify any embargo from OPEC?
Only a little. You know, we're actually, we haven't quite overtaken Russia yet, but we're using 18 million barrels of oil a day today. We're producing 7. That makes us the largest oil importer in the world. Okay, when the price of oil goes up, we are hit. Okay, we're hit big time. We're importing over 400 billion barrels of oil a year at $100. 4 billion barrels of oil a year at $100 a barrel. That's $400 billion. Okay, which is a deduction from our GNP equal to 4 million jobs at $100,000 a year each. So while the expansion of our oil production is a good thing, and I'm for it, it is insufficient. And furthermore, our major trading partners, many of them are very substantial oil importers as well. So when the price of oil goes up, they get hit. They can buy less from us. So we are hit both directly in terms of being looted with our own purchasing power, and we're also being hit by people who we would want to sell to losing their purchasing power. Okay. In other words, basically, if OPEC can sink Japan, they can really hit us too just by doing that. And we should want to flood the world with liquid fuels. And yes, that includes petroleum, and as much as we can expand our petroleum production, we should. But we have immense other resources, much larger than our petroleum resources. Natural gas, so much we're just throwing it away right now. Coal, so much that, you know, the Obama administration is trying to think of ways to keep it in the ground. I mean, let alone biomass, we have the strongest agricultural base of any country in the world. We can do much more than just expand our oil. So I'm all for expanded drilling. I very much approve of what's going on in the Bakken in terms of expanded oil production. But it's not enough to win the war.
All right, thank you. Our next question comes from Robert, and he asks, what do you know about the variable compression flex fuel car?
Okay. The alcohol fuels are higher octane than gasoline, which means that you can run higher compression with them and burn them more efficiently than gasoline can be burnt. Now, this is, in fact, what race car drivers do. Race car drivers have modified the engines of their cars to increase the compression, and they get more power and, for what it's worth, although this is not a major concern for them, more mileage out of methanol. And methanol has been a favorite among race car drivers since the 1960s. In fact, Roberta Nichols, the person who who introduced the first flex fuel car, she was actually a race car driver, and she won the world speed record on water, fastest speedboat on a methanol-powered speedboat called the Witch. And it's also a good fuel because it's less prone to fires if they have a crash. But the easiest thing to do to take advantage of the octane is just to change the timing tables, which can be done by programming. In other words, the computer of a car has spark tables, and if you get the timing to change in proportion as the air-fuel mixture changes to match the percent of methanol or ethanol in the fuel, you can get increased performance. That is how I actually got 24 miles to the gallon in that Cobalt I told you about running on M100, and the same car that gets 36 miles to the gallon on E10, which is basically gasoline with 10% ethanol in it. That's what you get at the pump here. So instead of getting half the mileage of gasoline, I got 2/3, perhaps a little less than 2/3 if you count that ethanol. Now, if you could also increase the compression, you could go even further. But that involves, well, you could easily manufacture cars with increased compression, but those would only be able to run on ethanol or methanol, and those would not be big sellers right now until we have methanol pumps all over the place. But there are people who talk about, and I believe it has been demonstrated, that you can have variable compression in a car and have the car have lower compression when it's running on gasoline and higher compression when it's running on alcohol. And if you put that together with variable timing, then you would have the ultimate flex fuel car that could get even better improvement in mileage than what I got. In other words, if I didn't adjust the compression of the Cobalt, I just ran it on methanol and adjusted the timing. So that's a step down the road. That will cost a bit more money for those kinds of engines. So I think the breakthrough is simply having the cars be flex fueled with variable timing, which can easily be implemented now with just suitable software. And then once you start seeing methanol pumps all over the place, and they will appear once a substantial number of cars can use the methanol, then there'll be a strong incentive to produce cars that even incorporate this improvement of variable timing as well as variable compression.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Zubrin. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for question and answers and for our session today. We very much appreciate you taking the time to discuss your book, Energy Victory, with us and to answer these questions. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone for being involved with Fuel Freedom.
All right. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining our discussion today. Don't forget to tune in next month on November 6th, where Fuel Freedom co-founder Eyal Aronoff will be discussing more of the Foundation's research and findings. And you can also participate in our next book club discussion, where former Shell CEO John Hofmeister will be speaking about his book, Why We Hate the Oil Companies. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a great day.